Longtime regional rivals Saudi Arabia and Iran have agreed to restore diplomatic missions after their foreign ministers met in Beijing Thursday. Now, this was the first face-to-face meeting of Saudi Arabia and Iran's top diplomats in more than 7 years, and you're seeing the moment there. Last month, the two nations agreed to re-establish diplomatic relations as part of a deal brokered by China. Both top regional powers have been involved in direct and in proxy conflicts around the region for years. For more, I want to bring in Eric Lobb. He's an associate professor of the Department of Politics and International Relations at Florida International University. Welcome, Eric. So what should we make of this as both nations agree to restore ties? What's the most optimistic view for a future between Iran and Saudi Arabia and all of their allies and adversaries?
Well, this is certainly a momentous development for Iran and for Saudi Arabia. As was mentioned, they hadn't had official or formal diplomatic ties since 2016. Tensions have escalated between the two countries, culminating with Iranian and Iranian-backed proxy missile and drone strikes against Saudi Arabia, hitting their oil facilities in 2019, which was quite a big deal. And so for both countries, for Iran, this mitigates its regional and international isolation. It had been facing an alliance between potentially Saudi Arabia, other Arab states, and Israel within the framework of the Abraham Accords. It's facing economic adversity with sanctions. It's also dealing with domestic protests. And for Saudi Arabia, this enhances its security, as well as, again, showing that it could reduce tensions and perhaps help with its domestic and even regional diversification plan, the Vision 2030 plan, away from oil and petroleum and gas.
And as you've just spelled out, it is so much more than just Iran and Saudi Arabia as far as who and where might be impacted. I mean, when you look at the Shia Crescent, as it's called, which really kind of emphasizes Iran's sphere of influence, you have countries like Lebanon, Syria, Bahrain, Iraq. The U.S. is also a factor here in its influence in the region, but China is the one mediating this. What does this then mean about U.S.-Chinese relations as far as who they have partnerships and alliances with in the Middle East?
Well, as you indicated or alluded to, it certainly can dial down regional tensions beyond just Saudi Arabia and Iran. When we look at protracted civil conflict and conflict zones in countries like Lebanon, Iraq, and particularly in Yemen, which has been labeled by the UN and other institutions as a humanitarian catastrophe.
Yeah.
In terms of what this means for U.S.-China relations and the role of both countries in the region, this is certainly, of course, a win for China, looking like enhancing its status as a diplomatic mediator in the region, as well as promoting stability so that it can engage economically and in other areas with both countries and even beyond. For the U.S., this is going to, for those who look at this as a zero-sum game, this could maybe look like a loss. But on the other hand, it could bring stability to the region potentially and allow the U.S., ironically, to disengage more from the region, to pivot more towards Asia, and to directly engage China in their own backyard.
And let's talk more about that relationship with China, because China is also partnering with Russia in its efforts in Ukraine in a way, when you look at the efforts both nations have made in communicating to the West and to the U.S. about what's happening there. China says it has no interest in spreading communism. It's got no hidden motives in what it's doing. But considering that, what does it look like from your point of view? What's in this for China?
Well, again, first of all, China wants to enhance its status. It is the world's first or second largest economy. It is a growing security force, and it wants to assert itself in a way that appears to be constructive in terms of being a regional and even international mediator. Of course, that may raise suspicions from Washington and in other capitals as well. It wants to promote, apart from enhancing its status, it wants to also stabilize areas so that it can engage economically and even in militarily and geopolitically, of course, to advance its own interests, as any nation would do. And so as a result, Washington and other capitals are going to sit back and look at this and figure out what way they're going to respond in terms of, again, whether this is a zero-sum game and a gain or a loss for the United States, or whether in some ways this could also spell some wins for the United States, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of its ability to disengage more from some regions and perhaps engage more closely in others.
Yeah, it's all fascinating to watch, the slow shift of geopolitics. Eric Loeb, thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much.